Hello and welcome back to the Champagne Anarchism reading series where we read cool books of leftist literature, these towering great leftist books. We are today reading and in fact finishing Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. We are doing chapter 5, that is Colonial War and Mental Disorders. This is the final chapter in the book, aside from the conclusion, which we will talk about in a little wrap-up video. If you haven't listened to the first 4 videos, the first 4 chapters, those are all available on Patreon for free. It's patreon.com/champagneanarchism. You can also find them on Spotify in audio form. And here on YouTube, I've just started with the videos on YouTube, so you can find the intro video on YouTube, but the audio podcasts for the first couple chapters you can't find here yet. But I'm hoping to figure out a way sort of around that if YouTube is your jam. I'll sort that out. But today we're closing the book. We're talking about this 5th chapter, and what I will say about this chapter is that this might be the most important chapter in the book. And if you've read any of Frantz Fanon, especially The Wretched of the Earth, you probably, chances are, have read this chapter. This is where Fanon, as the trained psychologist and trained psychiatrist that he is, he wraps up his experience at the Blis de Joinville Hospital in Algeria. Again, in the tail end of the 1950s, he's working at this hospital, and he's treating not just Algerian patients and freedom fighters in Algeria, but he's also treating the colonizers. He's treating the settlers in the area as well. So he's actually getting both perspectives. And as he's forming these ideas about how colonization affects our mental state and our psyche, he's actually seeing this from both sides. And he's seeing what this colonial violence can do, not just to the colonized, but to the colonizer in equal measure. And we'll talk about both in this video today. This may be one of his most important contributions over his life, this chapter. And the thing to note, especially about this chapter as well, is that it's in equal degrees clinical and passionate. So he's a scientist, right? He's a doctor. He's treating these as cases, and we'll see that he splits the cases that he speaks of in this chapter into 4 groups, series A, B, C, and D. And throughout that, he has this different classification, and he's talking about this in psychological terms, in terms of a reactionary psychosis is what he calls it. Today, we would probably use terminology more along the lines of post-traumatic stress disorder, something like that. The psychological jargon that he uses in this book is not quite what we have today. It's a little different, and some of the methods as well, which I'll talk about in a sec, also radically different from what we have today, but still interesting to read. So anyway, he's treating this as a scientist, but also remember that at the same time, even as he's working at this hospital, he's still very much aligned with the FLN, the Algerian resistance force in the country, and he is a revolutionary. So that is what I think this book is so good at. And that's why I think The Wretched of the Earth is often held up as one of the greatest works of leftist literature, especially decolonial literature. If you've taken a university class on colonization or decolonization as well, chances are you will read bits of Fanon, bits of The Wretched of the Earth. And it is because he presents this in such clear, data-driven, incisive detail, but the passion still comes through. He is still furious. He's angry with the situation, and you can feel that in the prose, even as he's presenting it as just pure medical science. And that's what I think Fanon is so good at throughout this entire work, but especially it all comes together in this chapter. One more thing to mention on the psychology of all of this. There are a couple things that he mentions at various points. One of them, for example, being deep sleep therapy. This is, if you've read the chapter already, you've probably seen the section where he mentions treating a patient with deep sleep therapy. This was quite popular in the 50s. They would essentially just drug people into a deep sleep, and they'd sleep sometimes for days. It is widely discredited. It is no longer used anymore. But, it started catching in popularity in the 1940s and really took off. And by the time Fanon is getting his medical training, it's very much in vogue. So he uses this to treat a patient in here. And it's just one of those examples of, okay, this stuff is very much of its time. The other thing that I should say before we dig into this chapter properly is that a lot of this comes with a huge trigger warning. So Frantz Fanon, he's not pulling any punches here. If you are likely to be triggered or offended or sort of even off-put, just put on the back foot by descriptions of rape and torture and murder, including child murder and mass murder, then this may be a good video to skip. This is a tough read. He quotes directly from a lot of these patients, and the descriptions are not holding anything back. And of course, Fanon is living through a really brutal time. He's watching an extremely vicious, violent struggle where both sides are committing acts of what we would probably consider to be war crimes. So if you are likely to be triggered by any of these things, please do put down the video or at least watch this with care. And certainly as you're reading the chapter, just be aware that a lot of this comes up often in quite explicit and horrifying detail. It's not an easy chapter to read, and I will say that to be clear. Again, I do think this is a very, very important chapter. And as I say with all of Fanon, like as I've said throughout this entire book, reading Fanon and understanding his mindset then is so important to how we understand our world now. When we talk about the revolutionary struggle and these movements, understanding this and the actual nitty-gritty of what's going on and how it changes people, how it literally influences their psychologies, is, I think, incredibly instructive and very, very important. And so I don't think you should lightly turn your eyes away from this, is all I will say on that point. Let's get into this chapter, though. I'm really excited actually to get into this. I've actually been waiting for this throughout the entire series. The first chapter I think is maybe my favorite of these chapters, but this is the one that everybody talks about. So this is where Fanon gives his case-by-case breakdown. And one of the things, the way I approach this chapter, especially as an anarchist, is it tells us a lot about violence and the way that violence is transmitted and criminality and our drive towards murder, the way it's transmitted by our social environment. Emma Goldman, whose book we will read later, and I have it on my desk here. This is Anarchism and Other Essays. This is a collection of her essays, and if you haven't read Emma Goldman, my God, go pick up some Emma Goldman. She's just spectacular. You can actually find all of these essays for free on the Anarchist Library online. It's very easy to access. Anyway, Emma Goldman famously asks this question, which is, what would society look like if people had what they needed and didn't have to fight for it? And this is Fanon kind of giving us the opposite side of that, right? So Fanon is saying, this is what happens when society is given nothing, when they are quite literally dehumanized and depersonalized to such a degree that they almost have no choice but to lash out. We saw in the first chapter when Fanon talked about violence as a necessary tool, not just for a revolution, but violence as an act of liberation. Violence itself can lead us to liberate ourselves. And we should be very careful here, because a lot of critics of Fanon, and I take huge exception to this, but a lot of critics of Fanon say that he's just fully advocating violence. And he certainly is, but he's not uncritical here. So Fanon, he's saying, look, I understand what violence does to a society. I understand what violence means and how violence changes people. We will see in the series, especially Series B, and in fact the tail end of Series A, I think, is really, really instructive in this regard. He knows what violence does to people. He knows how it changes society. He knows what a society emerging from this kind of violence looks like. In fact, he knows it very, very clearly and directly. And so a lot of people who come in and say, listen, he's advocating violence and a society, a revolution cannot just be based on violence. How do you construct a society that is peaceful after this wave of violence? Fanon, I think, would acknowledge that. I think he understands that. Now, Fanon starts this chapter, before we get into our first series, with the understanding that the primary goal of colonization is dehumanization. He has this quote, I'm reading from the Penguin Modern Classics edition, this one here. So your page numbers might be slightly different if you've got another one, but this is page 201 in my edition. He says, quote, "The Algerians, the veiled women, the palm trees, and the camels make up the landscape, the natural background to the human presence of the French," which is to say, they are so depersonalized that they have almost faded into the scenery. For the French who are there, and for the Pieds Noirs, who are the Algerian-born French colonizers in the area, the native Algerians are just sort of a piece of the scenery. This is something that I think is very important to understand. He starts from this complete dehumanization level and goes from there. Normally when I do these lectures, I try to create a structure that's helpful to understand the chapter, that's just my own invention that I can kind of take through and do bullet points instead of going piece by piece through the chapter. I give us sort of a structure to think about it. But Fanon, listen, he's a scientist, he's a doctor, he knows what he's doing here, and in this chapter he just lets it all loose. So we can just follow, I think, his own structure here from Series A through to Series D, and then some meditations on Algerian criminality at the end. So we'll be talking about each series, but one thing that we should note before we get right into it is the first case that he mentions. He doesn't actually give a series, he doesn't assign this case to a series, but he talks about a militant in a newly liberated African country. He doesn't tell us which country, but this militant is from a country that's just been liberated, and he was involved in the revolutionary struggle. And this militant planted a bomb during that struggle that killed many people. And now, after the revolutionary struggle, this militant has gone and met people who were formerly colonial settlers in the area and were actually very supportive of the movement towards new nationhood and the revolution. And he finds common cause with them. And now he starts to think about his actions during the war. And he's seeking treatment from Fanon because every year around the same time, he starts sleeping poorly and experiencing these kind of really intense mental episodes and severe depression, it sounds like. And the thing with this guy is that he understands that his action was necessary. He is not intending to repudiate the action at all. However, he does see himself, and this is why he seeks treatment from Fanon, he does see himself as a victim, a necessary victim in this struggle. He has essentially, psychologically, sacrificed himself for the good of the revolution, so this revolution can continue. And he understands that and accepts it, but still he's dealing with these incredibly painful and terrible consequences. This is how Fanon starts this chapter out. This is what Fanon begins with, is this man's story. And understanding, already we're starting to understand the impact of violence and dehumanization on the character of these revolutionaries that are fighting this struggle. This is not an easy thing, and this is not something that you can emerge from unscathed. Now let's get into the series. Let's actually get through this and let's just go for it. So Series A. Series A is where Fanon puts his cases. There are 5 of them here. He puts these cases where there are, he says, clear symptoms of mental disorder of the reactionary type. Now, again, reactionary psychosis is Frantz Fanon word, or a psychological word at the time, for what we might properly classify as something entirely different today. Most likely, again, post-traumatic stress disorder or something along those lines. But this is just his terminology. The first case that he mentions in this is a very tough case to read, actually. Remember, I think this is chapter 2 when we talked about this. I said that Fanon by no means is a feminist. Women in this book are very much an afterthought. He thinks that they are equal in the revolutionary struggle and an important part of the nation as it starts to build itself as a nation afterwards, but he's not particularly interested in a feminist struggle, and in his personal actions as a human being, he's also not particularly very much of a feminist at all. And so when we read this story about a man who suffers impotence after his wife is raped by French soldiers, and this man is struggling and trying to understand what his life means now, and struggling, of course, with impotence, and almost, it seems from his account, hating his wife for having gone through this. This is why this is very, very difficult to read, because you think, okay, Fanon, what about this woman? Why? What about this? What about her? And why isn't this man thinking of her? And in the end, this man realizes, or seems to realize at least, that she went through this experience to save him, and because she was worried about him. And he uses this fact to sort of reconcile himself to this new reality that he's living through. But it is a pretty unthinking, uncaring, and fairly overall disgusting representation of this case as a whole. Obviously, we are reading this with a modern lens. Maybe that's a little unfair, but if we held this case in the way that it's represented to modern standards, it's a little difficult to say. But either way, the takeaway that Fanon wants us to get from this is this idea that nobody really will emerge unscathed from this, and this is his first case to start to introduce this concept to us. The next case he talks about is a man who survives a mass murder, and after surviving this mass murder, he begins to experience undifferentiated homicidal impulses. He starts wanting to kill people. He, at one point, steals a gun, tries to kill some soldiers, is restrained and beaten, taken to the hospital, and Fanon is trying to treat this man. This is the man that he puts in the deep sleep therapy, which I have my doubts whether that worked or not, but Fanon seems to believe it had some effect. Now, this is just another example of that. The third case, I think, is where we get a little bit more of this idea here. So the third case is a man who kills a woman in revenge. His wife is murdered at point-blank range by a group of French soldiers. He goes to find one of the soldiers, and instead of finding the soldier to kill him, he finds his wife, and he kills the soldier's wife. And he starts getting haunted by visions of this woman, and he can't really shake them. And it's this examination for Fanon of a man who has experienced sort of an undirected sort of violence. It's not clear why his wife was murdered. It's not clear why he was thrust into this situation in the first place. But he is having to deal with the repercussions of their action, and that puts him in the situation where he murders this woman, who is, of course, French and maybe a French collaborator. I don't know. I know nothing about this woman, but to his eyes and for all intents here that we know of, she is innocent. And so he has to deal with his own culpability for having murdered an innocent woman as a revenge, some kind of, again, undifferentiated revenge against French soldiers who also murdered an innocent woman. This is something we kind of come back to quite a bit, especially when you read this book. This is something that's pretty easy to come back to every now and again, this idea of the senseless violence of this particular period of time, this particular war. It's a war often of attrition. It's a war of violent war crimes. It's a war where French soldiers come in and exterminate entire villages. We actually see one of these cases later on, I think it's Series B, where the French just absolutely, without any shred of mercy, just a mass murder, nearly an entire village. And Algerian resistance fighters are doing similar things. In fact, Fanon, at one point in his capacity as sort of roughly a public relations officer at a major newspaper, major French language newspaper in Tunis, aligned with the FLN, he tries to sort of excuse some of these war crimes that the FLN are doing. Just sweep some of them under the rug. He's very familiar with this violence that's going on, but he still understands it as necessary. Anyway, the fourth case to me is absolutely fascinating. This is where Fanon starts to get a little bit of the other side of this. So we've heard from the Algerian side. Now he's going to take us a little bit into the mindset of the French. So the fourth case, Series A, is a policeman, a torturer policeman who can't stop hearing screaming in his mind. And at one point, he actually meets one of his victims at the hospital. It's this whole kind of horrific ordeal, and Fanon has to convince the victim that it's a psychotic episode, and the victim tries to take his own life because he's seen his torturer there in the same hospital. Again, Fanon is trying to balance these two different things one off the other, and the policeman has this horrific reaction to it as well. And the police officer leaves. He gets to go to France. His victim, his torture victim, is left there in Algeria to suffer and to essentially be lied to by Frantz Fanon because he just can't tell him the reality that his torturer was admitted to the hospital for treatment as well, and that his torturer, poor torturer, is hearing the screams of his victims in his nightmares. And we see a little bit more of that Fanon contempt for his settler patients in the next case. And the next case, I think, is just fascinating as well. So the next case, again, this is another colonizer. This is a police inspector who is complicit in torture. He's torturing people, and he starts to slowly go mad. He starts sleeping poorly. He starts having nightmares. He starts getting these angry episodes, these mad episodes, he calls them. And he starts torturing his wife, his child. He's abusing them. He's beating them. He seems, from his account, to flip into a different person entirely. So over the course of him engaging in the violence of colonization and becoming the police inspector that he has had to become in this war as he's trying to put down the revolutionaries, he has become a significantly worse person. He has gained this evil attitude. He has been corrupted, we might say. Now, it's very easy to argue all of this existed before. All of this was just, I mean, he's a police inspector in colonial Algeria. Like, how good-hearted can he be? How corrupted could he have been? A lot of this must have been there originally, but taking Fanon at his word, and he quotes the police officer at length as the police officer is describing these really horrific scenes of torture, things that the police officer appears to believe are absolutely necessary for him to continue doing. He seems to say that things have gotten worse for him, that he has actually changed as a person. And this is Fanon nudging us and telling us, listen, this is something that doesn't just infect those colonized populations. This is something that changes the colonizers as well. Colonial violence is a two-way street. Remember in the first chapter, he's giving us this Manichaean struggle, right? One cannot exist without the other. The colonized only exist because the colonizer exists. And if the colonizer didn't exist, they wouldn't be colonized. The colonizer, just as the colonized are changed by the violent actions of the colonizer engaging in those violent actions at the behest of whatever government is over him is also similarly changed. Right, let's go and talk about Series B now. So Series B, Fanon calls these cases where the war is the proximate cause. So these are not cases where the individual was engaged directly in the war or the struggle. These are cases where people were just affected by the events around the war. And these are fascinating. The first case here is pretty tough to read. The first case he interviews these two Algerian boys who killed their European playmate. So this is a kid that they used to get along with. They used to play with, in fact, at their school. And now, because of the war, they have gone somewhat indiscriminately. Again, the European kid has not done anything to them directly, but they kill him. And they kill him because Europeans, in their minds, want to kill all Algerians, and they can't yet kill the big people, so they start with the small one. The second boy, when Fanon is talking to them, in this really moving passage that I read actually in the introduction video, so I won't repeat this again, but it's on page 218 in the Penguin Modern Classics if you want to go revisit that. But he essentially asks the second boy, why did you do that? And the kid tells him, or asks Fanon, if he's ever seen any Europeans in prison for killing Algerians. And Fanon says, no, actually he hasn't. And the kid says, well, but there are Algerians in prison all the time. And yet there are Algerians sent to prison all the time. He says, so why are only Algerians found in prisons? Can you explain that to me? And Fanon just says, no. They go on to have more of a conversation. This is really incredible interview, actually, with these two kids, but it's quite painful to read, and it is a symptom, right? This is the thing with these two children, and this is what Fanon understands as well. Fanon sees them as victims of a system. This is them understanding again, that Manichaean struggle, the us or them struggle that colonization necessarily frames. Either we beat the colonizer, we get the colonizer out of here, or we die. We continue to be dehumanized. We continue to have our culture wiped away. And so these kids understand that. They understand the systematic oppression, and they react in the only way that they know how, which is, again, they're in a location and place. Again, they're in a location and time that is steeped in violence. And so violence is what they know. The other thing that's maybe worth mentioning is that these kids are clearly willing to die for this struggle. They're already given over to the independence movement, which is crazy and really kind of harrowing to think about. The second case is also very, very interesting. So the second case is this man who tries to commit suicide, because suicide disguised as terrorist activity, by the way, because he feels like he's fallen away from the struggle. So this is a guy, he just makes copy machines, and he used to be kind of involved in the struggle, and now he's getting a little more into his work. He starts to sort of fall away a little bit from the revolutionary movement, and he feels himself pulling away from his family, from his friends, all of these people that are engaged in this struggle. And then he has this moment, this maybe a psychotic break, I don't know what you would exactly call it, but he starts hearing voices in his head calling him a traitor. And so he goes off and he goes into the European part of town. He has no papers, but nobody checks them because he looks European enough, French enough. He doesn't particularly look Algerian. And meanwhile, around him, Algerians are being checked left and right, and he just feels worse for that. And eventually he ends up attacking a guard post, yelling, "I am an Algerian." And he's taken and beaten. And in this very interesting quote, he says, "All I wanted to do was die. Even at the police barracks, I thought and hoped that after they'd torture me, they would kill me. I was glad to be struck, for that showed me that they considered that I too was their enemy." And then later on, he goes on to say, "I am not a traitor." And this to me is remarkable. And oddly, Fanon actually lets this story pass without too much analysis. He kind of just recounts the story and fits it into his classification. But this is a really, really interesting story to me, because this man is not a traitor. This man is just doing his ordinary life. But ordinary life at this point in time, at least to him, is clearly not enough. He needs to feel himself identified with the struggle itself. And all of his family, all of his friends, everybody that's engaged in this revolutionary us-them struggle, he doesn't feel part of that. And so he feels the need to go on a suicide terrorist attempt unprompted, and tries to get himself killed, and this way gets himself beaten and restrained, and through this somehow feels himself more Algerian, more, or I should say less of a traitor. It's a fascinating case. I don't know what more to say on this, but reading this, even now, even recounting it again, I can't help but go, why did Fanon not give us a little more analysis around this? This is a fascinating case. The next case, case three, is a French woman. So this is a French woman. Her father, I see him a bit like the police inspector from series A. He is torturing people, and she hears this in the house as she's growing up. She just hears this in the background, these screams of the people that are being tortured. And she watches her father kind of descend again into a type of madness. He becomes consumed by hunting down revolutionaries, and she watches him kind of fall off a cliff, and then eventually he's killed in an ambush, and she has this dissonance that she just can't reconcile. And we can blame her or not for doing something or not doing anything in this struggle, right? It's unclear how much agency she actually has in this, what she could have done, if anything, to be a little bit more of a part of this revolutionary struggle, or at least help the people who were in her father's captivity. This is a crazy thing to just be around and be watching, but this is the nature of the colonial administration. So maybe we can't necessarily blame her too much, but she starts experiencing this neurosis, what Fanon refers to as a neurotic attitude. And she bears a little bit of hatred for her father. She has this quote, this is page 223, where she says, "The funeral sickened me," she said. "All those officials who came to weep over the death of my father, whose, quote, high moral qualities conquered the native population, end quote, disgusted me. Everyone knew that it was false. There wasn't a single person who didn't know that my father had the whip hand of all the interrogation centers in the whole region." This is also pretty remarkable. And again, right, this is collateral damage of this colonial system. This is not a person who's directly engaged in the struggle. Again, we can question whether she did enough or indeed anything to help the situation, but she was not actively engaged. And even so, she herself is infected by this violence, everything that's going on around her, her father. And she starts to take on this hatred and, again, the dissonance of what she's living and the things that are being done around her. And it's this really fascinating passage. So cases 2 and 3 in the Series B, I think, are maybe the most interesting. Now, cases 4 and 5 under Series B are pretty rough. They're not specific people, but Fanon mentions in the fourth case, behavioral disturbances in children under 10 in Algeria. They're refugee children. They develop a close love for images of parental figures. They have noise phobia, a bunch of different symptoms that pop up in these young children that go through this experience. So he mentions those. And then case 5 is about mental disorders around childbirth, again, among refugees. So there's this constant state of war, which means that few Algerian women escape at least some kind of disorder while they're giving birth. So he brings this up, and he does recognize, although he doesn't specifically reference an individual in these cases. And that brings us to Series C. And Series C is all about torture. Now, we're only going to talk about Category 1 and Category 4 here, but if you want more details on the effects of torture on Algerian victims, then you can read all of Series C. It is fascinating, but I think it's worth highlighting these two above all, because the first category is after indiscriminate torture. So after indiscriminate torture, patients, Fanon says, they feel a deep injustice. They feel an indifference to moral arguments whatsoever, and they seem to have lost themselves. They've lost some sort of internal mechanism that just keeps them regulated. Fanon seems to be telling us that they're off kilter now. And he speculates as well, because he identifies people with information who gave it up, people without information who could give nothing up, and people with information who gave nothing up. And he mentions that he never treated a patient who had real information and gave it up. And he speculates, probably quite rightly, that these people were just killed. Now, Category 4 is brainwashing. And he talks specifically about an intellectual who's sent to a re-education camp. And normally intellectuals are not released from these brainwashing camps, these re-education centers, but this guy was. And normally you try as an intellectual in one of these places to demonstrate that you have been re-educated, that you no longer believe what you believed before. And the fact that he's released really throws him. The fact that he, among all of these people that he's in with, actually got out makes him wonder whether he believed sufficiently in the first place, whether he internalized anything while he was in there, whether he's wrong or they're playing a game, and when this game will end. And the way Fanon describes this, you see this all unfolding, and it is hard to read this bit, and it feels a bit like something straight from the pages of 1984. The last series is Series D, and this is just kind of a rough breakdown of a lot of the psychosomatic disorders. So things like ulcers, menstrual disorders, sleep issues, tachycardia, like all of this stuff that is just happening around that we don't necessarily notice or attribute to the struggle, but is almost definitely involved. And so Fanon, with all 4 of these series, has given us a classification and a very clear view of what this looks like, of what a colonial resistance and this colonial violence does to people individually on a psychological level, by proxy, those around us, those just viewing the struggle, by torture, so those literally that have seen torture and horrible tactics visited upon them, and just collateral damage out in the rest of society, these psychosomatic disorders, which is Series D. Now, we're not quite done with the chapter because Fanon closes this chapter with a meditation on the current, or then current, I should say, received wisdom of the medical community, which was literally taught back then, which was that Algerians are just criminals, that criminality is endemic to the Algerian population, that's just how they are. It's hardwired into the brain. And Fanon quotes some experts, including some in the medical field that he's had to deal with, in saying these, what we would probably consider today to be absolutely insane things. Although, I think there are parallels to our modern day about the way we think about impoverished communities and high crime. But nonetheless, this is very much what is being taught and what is being said and what is understood at the time back then. And Fanon's entire point here, and I think this is absolutely dead on the money. I mean, this is perhaps revolutionary at the time, but something that we should not be surprised by now. He says that criminality is caused by the environment and not anything hardwired into the brain of the ordinary Algerian citizen. And this is not a quick aside. Fanon is taking the time to pull these arguments from his opponents and talks about a medical expert, Dr. A. Carruthers, who says things like Algerians don't use their frontal lobes, things like that, just insane medical science things, and tries to pick this apart because Fanon is really concerned that he gets this point across, which is that our lived environment, the thing that we grow up in, this, in his case, colonial world, gave rise to violence. It gave rise to criminality. It gave rise to the effects that the French are seeing. The very things that the French feel like they need to crack down on are caused by the French in Algeria. He says Algeria's criminality can be explained by a war that broke the country in two. He has this quote on page 250 where he says, "The Algerian's criminality, his impulsivity, and the violence of his murders are therefore not the consequence of the organization of his nervous system, nor of a peculiar trait in his character, but the direct product of the colonial situation." And that is something to answer that Emma Goldman question that I raised at the beginning of this lecture, right? What would a society look like if people had what they needed instead of having to fight for it? I think that is kind of the crucial insight that comes from this chapter. This is Fanon saying the conditions matter. The environment matters. All of the things that we are seeing and doing and experiencing, that creates something in us. It changes our literal psychology. It changes the way our brains work. It can dehumanize somebody who is a colonized person. It can change in a very dark way towards a violent bent a colonizer or a person who finds himself or herself caught up in this colonial machine that is taking over Algeria. This is a crucial insight from Fanon, and I think it's impossible to overstate just how important this idea is right at the end of this chapter. And Fanon says, of course, because he's Frantz Fanon, that the revolution changed everything. That the revolution brought people together. And that's The Wretched of the Earth. That's Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. We have finished with this book. I'll come back with a quick summary video. Nothing more than a few sort of main takeaways and things to maybe think about and discuss. And there I'll talk a little bit about the foreword, the Jean-Paul Sartre foreword, and Fanon's own conclusion, which I don't think is anything that will surprise anybody. But with this, we have finished the reading series, and that's exciting. It's been really, really exciting to see this take off. Especially, I've loved getting questions on TikTok and stuff like that. I just think that's really cool. Please do keep those coming, keep those engaged, and as always, feel free to go to the Patreon and leave any comments anywhere you like about any of this stuff. If you're engaging with it, if you're thinking about it, if there's a takeaway that you took away from Fanon, I would absolutely love to hear it. And the next book that we are doing is on the other side of colonization. This is Arundhati Roy's Capitalism, a Ghost Story. We are about to start this book. Next week, you will have the introductory lecture along with final thoughts on Frantz Fanon, and we'll start in on this book. This is a short one, splitting it into 3 sections. Just 3. We're not doing the 5 like Fanon because it is. I mean, look at this thing. This is short. This is not too hard to get through. But Arundhati Roy she's a novelist. She's a brilliant novelist, in fact. If you've ever read The Ministry of Utmost Happiness or God of Small Things, which is her debut novel and it's just a work of genius, you will appreciate how brilliant a writer Arundhati Roy is. And then when you get into her political thinking and the way that she writes an essay, especially about capitalism, it is just spectacular. It's a spectacular read. I cannot wait to dive into this one. This one's exciting. Thank you, as always, for joining. As always, let me know what you think, and thank you for watching.